I'm really excited to be here. It's a lot of very interesting information that I learned, and I hope you enjoy the program and some of the information that we have. I did this program over the Society of Lifelong Learning at Nicely Center in Bowling Green. And so I wrote this in March. So some of the names I'll forget because I wrote it back in February and April. But anyway, I am not a professional historian. I'm an amateur historian. I read a lot about the Civil War when I was in high school and college, and much less now. Mostly I work on the War of 18. I work mostly on the Pacific War, World War II, and a little bit on Korea. I was a Federal Army officer, so I'm going to take it from the side of the sort of the Union as a Union soldier. The lost cause myth. We'll talk about that a little bit. It's a very important kind of concept that goes on in the difference between what history says and what sort of is the underlying story that people sort of still believe about the Civil War. When I went to high school, the textbooks had what? They had 11 causes for the Civil War, when really it was one cause of the Civil War. It was actually a matter of fact. Any short class on a topic of this wide, right? An entire Civil War, an entire brigade of soldiers, a political election, I'm going to oversimplify. And oversimplify is, as a sort of historian, is partially a problem. So I apologize for the fact that I'm going to have to oversimplify things a little bit. Here's some key references. Some of these, this is a diary. This one's a diary we'll look at a little bit. Shelby Foote, he was a writer first, a novelist first, and then he started writing about Civil War, and he became even more famous, Shelby Foote. I think he was from Mississippi or Alabama. These two are pretty new. This is just on 1 year of the war, about how Kentucky decided what to do about the war, which side to take, how they navigated that. This one is about the lost cause. Annie Marshall, she's pretty good. And then a brief history of the Civil War in Kentucky, as opposed to Kentucky in the Civil War. So that's two different books. That was part of a history series. And I got quite a bit of stuff about the election from the website. This is the old Capitol building. The old Capitol building became a museum eventually, the legislature building. And one of the funny stories about that was that they handed over some of the artifacts to the Daughters of the Confederacy, and they took all the Union flags and put them in the basement, rolled up on the floor, and they took the Confederate flags, they put them on the wall and put plastic over them, which immediately started to disintegrate and actually ruin them. So there's a little... I met the guy that runs this now, a curator. He did a talk on militia, Kentucky militia, last week at SLL, and I talked to him. It was pretty fun. Here's some characters in our drama. Both presidents were from Kentucky. They were not as well known in Kentucky because they had lived other places and they served in other legislatures. Lincoln was mainly known as being from Illinois, where he was a lawyer for a long time, and Jefferson Davis, senator from Mississippi. So here are some of the characters: Abe Lincoln, Jefferson Davis. Henry Clay was important because as long as Clay was alive, the Civil War wasn't likely to happen. He was a great compromiser. We have three great orators: Calhoun from South Carolina, Webster from Massachusetts, and Clay, and they were able to sort of keep the tightrope. John C. Breckinridge at the start of the story is the vice president, youngest vice president ever, and he becomes the father of the orphans. Anybody know who Robert Anderson is? Yes, he was a major at Fort Sumter. And P.T. Beauregard lined up that cannon for the first shot at Sumter to fire against his old artillery teacher from West Point. He ends up being in the state at the beginning of the war, trying to sort out which side Kentucky's going to take, right, and what to do. Zachary Taylor was well known for being from Kentucky, Virginia, but he lived in Kentucky most of his life. Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe was from Connecticut, but she came to Kentucky, and she wrote a pretty important novel that Mr. Lincoln said when he met her. He said, "For a little woman, you should stir some stuff up." McLaughlin is the governor. Albert Sidney Johnston is the first Confederate commander of this Western theater. Buckner was the person that was in Kentucky trying to figure out what to do with the home guard versus the state guard. John Hunt Morgan was in the brigade a little while. He started out with just a battalion of cavalry. Eventually he becomes an independent, like many of them, like Forrest, raiding all over the place, trying to disrupt the Union lines. John Bell Hood he started the war out west, out in the east, became famous in the 7-day battles, and then ended up controlling the army after they gave up trying to stop Sherman, and they came up and tried to take Tennessee back. I didn't do it fast enough. George W. Johnson, he's in our story. He gets killed in one of the battles, we'll see. He was the Confederate governor when the Confederates decided they were going to form their own state legislature here in Russellville and Bowling Green and all that. So he ends up getting sworn in one of the battles as a private, and then he gets killed. So these are the 5 things I want to talk about. The background, the election. To me, I want you to think carefully about this 1860 election, because it is so different than what we're used to. It's just, as you look at it now, it's just almost insane to me to think that the United States had an election like that was so kind of out there, so different, I guess. We're going to look a lot at one campaign, Stones River, which is about 70 miles down the road here. You can go see it, right outside of Murfreesboro, where Breckinridge called the brigade My Orphans. That's where they got the name. Initially, they were the First Kentucky Brigade. And then we'll talk about some of the anecdotes to try to show you a little bit about what the soldiers said. Now, it's not exactly them talking, because when you write, you don't talk and write the same way, but it is things that they wrote down that we have about them. And there's a few anecdotes. Okay? Fair enough? The First Kentucky Brigade. So it started with the beginning of the war, and these militias were forming to try to figure out what to do if there was going to be a war after the election. Camp Boone, most of the brigade ended up mustering at Camp Boone. Kentucky said it was neutral right from the beginning. The legislation passed immediately and said, we're going to be neutral. We're going to mediate both sides of our friends on both sides of us, and we're going to mediate, and we're going to stay neutral. But some people had already made up their mind one way or another, obviously, and so both armies were recruiting on outside of the borders. And Camp Boone is right over by Clarksville. The brigade initially was the 2nd Kentucky Infantry, the 3rd Infantry, the 4th Kentucky Infantry, the 5th Kentucky Infantry. There were 2 different 5th Kentucky Infantries. One of them ended up turning into the 9th based on what day they had started. And it's pure Army stuff. 3 batteries, Cobb, Graves, and Byrne batteries. In the beginning, they had a couple of cavalry units, 3 cavalry units, 1 Tennessee, that were battalions. Eventually, it was just infantry and the artillery. That was it. Very scarce weapons were very scarce in the beginning. We'll talk about that a little bit more. They formed as a brigade in Bowling Green. When Albert Sidney Johnston finally went into Kentucky to try to hold the line between Columbus, where the heights were on the Mississippi, all the way over to Cumberland Gap. Bowling Green was sort of the center of that, and that's where the brigade was. For many times, it included other regiments to bring it up to a full-size brigade. So that's basic overview. So we're talking about a brigade. So to make sure we're all on the same page here, how the military is formed is sort of important. First of all, both armies were militia armies. They were raised armies of volunteers and citizen soldiers at first, and then eventually became professional soldiers. But they were not at the beginning, right? Only 3% of the United States Army at that time had regular Army units in it. The rest were these. That's why they always said what state they were from, right? It always said what state that the unit was in the Civil War. Both units started with volunteers. They eventually used the draft. Recruiting was done by the regiment, for a regiment. So somebody would go out and say, I'm going to raise a regiment in a state, and he would try to get enough men for a regiment, which was 10 companies, or about 1,000 men. Does that make sense? So a regiment was about 1,000 men. You have a squad, which would be about 10 men, a platoon about 30 to 40 men, company would be about 100 men, sometimes more or less. 8 or 9 companies to a regiment to make up the 1,000 men. The Federal Army named things after water or rivers, not areas. You'll often see the name of the battles that are different, but depending upon which side. Rebel units would replace. So if you were from Virginia, Virginia could send more recruits into your units. The Federal Army didn't do that. The Union Army did not do that. Brigade, led by a brigadier, had 3 to 6 regiments and some batteries. That's what a brigade normally looked like. Brigadier General, called Brigadier because he's commander of a brigade. That's how Brigadier General got named. 3 or so brigades make a division. A division can make a corps. Sometimes the Union Army would use wings. Sometimes the Confederate Army used wings too. And the Union Army at sometimes joined armies. So Battle of Chattanooga was 2 armies and one that was as big as an army that was going to a corps under Hooker. This is. Okay, so that's basic background. Any questions on the basic military concept? So we're going to talk a little bit about the elections. Elections mattered. 1860, and then the election in Kentucky in 61 that followed that is a very most difficult to explain. Kentucky has to navigate between being a border state to decide what to do. So there's plenty of people that want to stay on the Union side and plenty of people that want to go south. So what is the impact that Kentucky becomes a border state and is clearly not on either side? And here's our cause and effect. Have a controversial election. The state declares themselves to be neutral. Immediately, the legislature passes that. The divided states try to compromise between both sides. They believe in both sides. One, they believe that the right to have the slaves is necessary evil, and they believe that the Union should not be broken up. They then decide they're going to hold new elections in 61. So to try to make sure that everybody was sort of telling the government was going to work with that. And it had very interesting results. 8 of the 9 seats in that election, this is after Lincoln is the president, 8 of the 9 seats at the House of Representatives in Washington go to the Union side. The Jackson Purchase was the only one that wasn't. 75 to 25 in the legislative, the House. Some of the secessionists boycotted this election, so that makes it a little bit difficult. And 27 of the senators were Union versus 11. You also had a split guard going on. You had Buckner forming the state guard. Remember, we're thinking we're going to be neutral, that we might get invaded by either side, so they're trying to form the militia to try to get up to snuff because they don't have any regular soldiers. General Polk, who's a politically appointed general, decides he can't give up the Columbus Bluffs because that blocks the Mississippi River. And so he sends Pillow across the river, and that gives permission, because he's now violated the neutrality that everybody agreed to come in. That once that happened and the state became neutral but stayed within the Union, then that made it difficult for the Confederate brigades, the Confederate units, to continue to do that. Is there any setting we can do to change this so it doesn't do that? Or is that my computer that's doing it?
Should be your computer, your screensaver. You can have to get out of this.
Okay.
Well, where's your mouse? There you are. Let's see.
No, don't worry
This is a
about it.
Mac. This is a little bit different from
Yeah, no, it's different. It's a Mac.
Yeah. There's your screensaver settings, which you can change.
Okay.
And I'm used to using a Word, and so I'm not.
So this is the presidential elections before the election. We're going to talk about the 1860 election. So 1863, Van Buren wins. He's a Democrat. 1840, William Henry Harrison wins. He's a Whig. 1844, Polk wins. He's a Democrat. Then Zachary Taylor's a Whig. Pierce is a Democrat. Buchanan is a Democrat. But notice what Kentucky does. Whig, 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 and then there's no Whig party left. They implode after the Nebraska compromise, and Buchanan, they vote for the Democrat. So it's very interesting. Notice also how many of these elections have lots of different parties. There were 5 different men that got electoral college votes in that election. Some state, at least a state and more than one, voted in that election. Tyler became the president because Harrison died right afterwards, right? Fillmore became the president after Taylor died. Fillmore runs 3 or 4 times. He's in this election we're going to talk about in a second. So that's the run-up to this election. And notice how Kentucky is doing it. So that's very important, how Kentucky is doing it. Here are the major political decisions that occurred before the Civil War. The Missouri Compromise in 1820. Remember the big 3? So Clay and those guys are all involved in that. Compromise of 1850, which includes the Fugitive Slave Act. What does that mean? What's the Fugitive Slave Act mean? Slaves are property and you can't hide them or whatever. That's my property. If I go to your state, doesn't matter if you're a free or slave state, you have to give him back. The Kansas-Nebraska compromise essentially broke the Whig Party, right? So they stopped being a political force. The Dred Scott case in 1857. Dred Scott is not a person, he's a slave. And then the election of 1860, which causes the Civil War, oddly enough. The Whig Party formed in 1834 to 1850, and it was against, I can't make this up, because many people, the Whigs were very interested in the fact that they thought that Andrew Jackson, King Andrew, was too much like a king. And they were trying to stop having kings. So they formed a party of the Whigs, and you saw how successful they were. Without Clay, Webster, or Calhoun, there's a vacuum in the 1860 election. You have single party, issue parties all the time. This is the election before that, just to show you what states are involved. In the next election, Oregon is going to be in, and there's another state here next to Wisconsin, Minnesota, I guess. But that's what came before this. Buchanan was a Democrat, and he won with 45% of the vote. Again, Fillmore, this is the Know Nothing Party. What a great idea. Know Nothing Party. The name of your party is Know Nothing. There were a lot more parties in this election, too, before that. Okay, so I want you to do a little mind game here. There are 4 main people that are running. I'm going to talk about each of the 4 of them for the president. These are the main 4. There's actually more than that. But Lincoln as a Republican, Stephen Douglas from Illinois as the Lincoln-Douglas debate as a Democrat. But the Democrat Party divides, And John Breckinridge, the vice president, and the man from Kentucky, senator from Kentucky, is running. And then John Bell from Tennessee, in a new party they form because they think the Republicans might win. So there were 303 electoral college votes to spread between these four people, and there's 4 million votes, 42 votes. So just think in yourself, where does this fall? Who gets how many votes, just in your mind? I'm going to go through sort of their individual places. Stephen Douglas, he doesn't get picked by the Democratic Party until the second convention. They have a convention in Charleston that fails. They have another convention in Baltimore that succeeds. Some of the people walk out and go across the street to another place, another meeting hall in Baltimore, and they pick Breckinridge because they don't like Douglas. So the Democratic Party divides. So then John Bell, the Constitutional Union Party, from the Whigs and the Know-Nothings, form another party, and then Abraham Lincoln is able to win on a very difficult Republican convention in Chicago. So let's talk about these men. So this is Breckinridge over here, and that's Douglas. Douglas was what everybody thought was going to be, the race was going to be between Douglas, they thought, and whoever was going to win, probably William Seward, the Republican that went into the convention under it. Again, it was held in Charleston. They went through 56 ballots, 57 ballots before they gave up and went home. He could not get, he was winning, Stephen Douglas was winning, but he could not get enough seats, and they gave up and he went home. So then they came back in Baltimore, and he got it on the 59th ballot, and he became the nominee for the split Democratic Party. And at the same time, they decided to send Breckinridge and the guy from Oregon Lane to be another Democrat to run separate, and Breckinridge is important because he is actually the guy that is with the brigade and famous for the brigade. The next two are Lincoln and John Bell. The Constitutional Party was essentially the status quo party. This was their main thing. He's from Tennessee. The main thing was that the Union as it is, the Constitution as it is. That's what his thought process was. And then the Republicans were in Chicago. They were in a building called the Wigwam. And Lincoln was not expected to win that at all. Everybody thought that Seward would win. Another guy that was running, Salmon Chase, he was from Ohio. A guy named Bates from Missouri. Freeman, the guy that fought in the Mexican War, and the explorer, John Fremont, and who had run the first Republican time that anybody ran for president from the party was there. Okay. The problem was all of the candidates, other than Lincoln, had sort of some other problems going on. And some of them, like Greeley, the New York Tribune, who had loved him, he was a senator from New York. He was a governor of New York. He was well known for the Whigs, and everybody thought he would win, but many of the people in the party thought he was too anti-slave, and that we needed somebody more moderate. Lincoln, they thought, was more moderate. So they ended up picking Lincoln. One of his friends brought a couple of rails, fence rails in that he supposedly had cut down and said, yeah, the rail, he's our rail candidate, because he's so tall. So Lincoln. So going back to what do you think happened in this election? So we have two people from Kentucky, right? We have two people from Illinois, because Lincoln's sort of from both. You have John Bell, who's from Kentucky. So who's going to win the election, and by how much do you think? We know Lincoln wins it, right? But what do you anybody got this is the crazy part. You can't make this up. So here's the actual end of the election. Notice that the green is Breckinridge, Southern Democrats. Again, Northern Democrats, who got the second most votes, Stephen Douglas, that everybody thought was going to win, actually only got one state. The constitutional unions got 4 states, including Kentucky. So they didn't vote. Kentucky didn't vote for Breckinridge, even though he's from Breckinridge. He was the vice president and he was a senator from Kentucky. They didn't vote for that because they were afraid of what was going to happen. Here's the actual exercise. Lincoln got 180 of those votes, electoral college votes, and only 39% of the votes. In Kentucky, he only got 1,300 votes. That's it. Douglas came in second. He got the second most votes, but the lowest, look how low his electoral college, only 12, whereas Breckinridge got 72. He won many states. And then Bell got 39 from those 3 states, and 12% of the vote. Kentucky voted 60,000 versus 1,000 for Lincoln. So this weird election sort of is what drives what happens in Kentucky with them being neutral. The governor is, McGoffin passes the legislature to pass the Neutrality Act. They're trying to go on both sides. The first thing that happens is the people from like Tennessee, who's very worried about not having a border, being on the border themselves instead of Kentucky, they try to get them to succeed. And Lincoln tells him he's got to bring troops out because he's made a government call out. And the governor says no to both. No, talk to the hand. We're neutral. We're not going to participate in either side. I already told you about the August elections. Lincoln talks about the House divided. Kentucky represents that. Kentucky, of all the slave states, has the lowest average number of slaves per owner, 5.4. 57% of the people in Kentucky that have a slave own fewer than 5. Many have only 1. There are only 70 families in Kentucky that own over 50 slaves, and only 7 in the entire state that have over 100. There are no farms in Kentucky that have over 300 slaves. I want you to think about that number when you think about these other states below us and how many slaves in some of these plantations that they had. Kentucky was not like that, right? Kentucky was on the river and was trade, and they were small slave states. The geography. The rivers, the Cumberland Gap here. We have the 3 population centers. The river is very important. Everything we do comes up and down the river, and going all the way to Mississippi is very important. And then we only have 3 railroads. We have the railroad from Louisville to Nashville. We have the railroad between Louisville and Frankfort, between Frankfort and Lexington. Those are the only railroads. This is a look at the population aspect of states around us. So if you're living in Kentucky at that time, I want you to think about what you think would happen if a civil war comes and where the threat might be. So if you're right here in Kentucky, you have 930,000 people living in the state. Tennessee below you only has 835. Ohio has 2.3 million. Illinois has 1.7 million, and Indiana has 1.35 million. So when you think about having 3 states, all of which are much bigger than you, so let's say you raise 150 infantry regiments to defend yourself against an invasion, and each one of them could raise between double or 75% more than you can raise, right? So you can imagine what that would look like. If Kentucky had succeeded, what was going to happen very quickly was what? They were going to get invaded, and they were going to get overrun almost immediately. Which was probably why, we don't know this for sure, but that's probably why this happened the way it was. Kentucky remains neutral. Lincoln had said to lose Kentucky, because of the geographic position where it was to lose the whole effort. Nobody was happy, right? So you had both sides in the state, and nobody was really happy about it. There are some advantages to being a border state, though. Is one, you didn't get any draft called up, and none of the slaves got taken away because you were a border state. When the Emancipation Proclamation happened, that only was in the states who had succeeded, and it didn't happen to anything to Kentucky. Okay, here's the campaigns of the Orphan Brigade. Southern Kentucky Defense, Fort Donaldson. If you haven't been to Fort Donaldson and Henry, those are very interesting and they're not very far away. Shiloh Campaign, Vicksburg, Stones River, Chickamauga, Chattanooga, Atlanta. By the time they got to after the Atlanta campaign and they had taken losses and there was no way to replace any of the soldiers because they were orphans, right? They were out of the state. You couldn't go back and get anybody from Kentucky to join the brigade. So every time they took losses, they got smaller and smaller, and they eventually became a mounted force because cavalry regiments are much smaller than infantry regiments, and they could do that. This is the book that used to be, this is the map that was inside the book. I wish I had a better copy of it. They started here, they came down here, they fought in Shiloh, they went over here, they went down to Vicksburg, Baton Rouge, back up to Mobile, some of them. They went up to Murfreesboro, back down, Chickamauga, Chattanooga, Atlanta, down to Jonesboro, and then all of that over there is the stuff they did for cavalry. So we're going to talk about the naming of the orphans. John Breckinridge, a pretty young man, like I said, the youngest vice president ever, 57 to 61. He got elected in the 60 election to become a senator. He wasn't a senator for very long. He got chased out because he had two Southern views and they didn't want him in Washington. But he was elected as a senator. And again, he came in electoral college-wise second in the election. He was a big advocate of neutrality. Started out as a brigadier general and went all the way up. Eventually, he became the Secretary of War. In February 1865, that says 1865, he was so well regarded by Jefferson Davis that he became the Secretary of War. And that's how he ends the war. This painting was done by Andy Thomas, 6th Kentucky. I saw this picture about 5 years ago. It's a pretty new picture. And that's when I started getting interested in the brigade. There was also a history professor, Kiriko, who talked about the Orphan Brigade at Western, a history professor. I used to talk to Jack Thacker all the time. He'd take the cadets out on battle staff rides. So we're going to go a little bit out of order. We're going to talk about how they got to be the orphans. The period after the invasion of Kentucky and the failure of the Confederates to recontrol the state or to get any significant recruits. So after Perryville, they fell back at Murfreesboro, just below. So let's look at I'm going to show a short movie. There'll probably be an ad.
And then prepared for a movement against Nashville. The whole campaign had just cost needless death and a tactical victory, but strategic defeat for the Confederate Army.
This was the beginning of the Stones River campaign. Can everybody hear?
Thousands of Kentuckians he theorized that would flock into his invading army did not materialize. President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, approved the movement made into Middle Tennessee, and the Army of Tennessee started its march. Union General William Stark Rosecrans replaced General Don Carlos Buell as commander of the newly named Army of the Cumberland. Previously, Rosecrans had done good service in the assaults against Corinth, Mississippi. Abraham Lincoln, who back in September had issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, knew that the full proclamation would take effect on January 1st, and he needed victories to validate taking such a strong action. In the East, General Ambrose Burnside led the Union Army of the Potomac during one of the Union's most disastrous defeats.
There's one fatal flaw in every lighter.
We're going to go
and nobody talks
to
about it. So we built one that fixes it.
the
You see,
second
nearly
day.
every lighter still.
This next engagement would do much to calm the nerves of the president. Throughout November and into December, the Confederate cavalry commands of Nathan Bedford Forrest and John Hunt Morgan had plagued Rosecrans' army, who was preparing for their own movement against the Confederates occupying Murfreesboro. The division commander rode off to form his brigades. The time of the assault made meet with him and about the attack near McFadden's Ford.
So after the first day, the brigade is going to conduct an attack 2 days later.
A very dangerous situation for a general. Personally looking over the proposed ground, convinced the former vice president that the attack shouldn't be made. Bragg called on Breckinridge to meet with him, and for 2.5 hours the generals talked about the attack. Breckinridge tried to convince Bragg not to order the assault, but the Southern Army commander would not hear it. Bragg even told Breckinridge the time to attack, 4 p.m., but an hour before dark. The meeting ended at 2:30, and the division commander rode off to form his brigades. The time of the assault may have seemed odd, but there was logic in the timing. If Breckinridge's division could successfully take the hill near McFadden's Ford, darkness would prevent the Union from launching a counterattack. For Rosecrans, he began getting reports from Colonel Samuel Beatty that artillery and infantry were moving in his front and that it could result in a major attack. Beatty's division was on the east bank of the river, the troops Bragg wanted driven to the other side. Rosecrans acted quickly and by 3 p.m. had assembled 4 brigades in reserve behind Beatty, overlooking McFadden's Ford. 1 brigade from Brigadier General John Palmer's division, 2 brigades from Brigadier General James S. Negley's division, and Morton's Pioneer Brigade.
Hanson, that's the Orphan Brigade.
Within his division prior to the assault.
So there's 4 brigades, 2 up and 2 back.
An hour before the division was to step off, Gideon Pillow, an incredibly well-connected Tennessee politician, had used his political ties to gain a generalship in the Mexican-American War, and he did the same thing in the Civil War. He had been suspended in April 1862 by President Davis, and Pillow resigned in October of that same year. But Davis rescinded encompassed the Confederate ranks when General Hanson, commander of the Orphan Brigade, heard the orders that Breckinridge passed down to him from Bragg. Hanson said the orders was tantamount to murder and that he would kill Bragg to prevent it from happening. Both Breckinridge and
there's literally people that say he would have killed Bragg.
Had to restrain Hanson.
He would have rode over there and killed the army commander because he thought it was a bad idea to attack.
Fire one volley and then drive them with the bayonet. At about 4 p.m., the signal gun sounded and the Kentuckians division stepped off, but a small pond next to the river slowed down the 6th Kentucky, so they lagged behind the rest of the brigade. Breckinridge himself followed close behind the Orphan Brigade, made up of mostly Kentuckians as they pushed forward. The Federal troops had thrown up makeshift breastworks, but were only able to get off a few small volleys before they began to fall back to the second line. The rebels surged forward and took much of the knoll that was their objective, but they had lost their commander. Breckinridge and his staff were within a few yards of Price's abandoned breastworks when they spotted Hanson, entangled with one another. Additionally, they had compacted themselves into a small area, allowing Fife's brigade to deliver infiltrating fire into Pillow's flank.
Notice that some of the brigade has crossed the river.
Came to Pillow's rescue, along with Wright's artillery, and fought off the 44th Indiana and 13th Ohio. But that still did not solve the problem of intermingled regiments, so confusion reigned throughout the front line. There was not much else to do but move forward for the Confederates, but as the gray-clad troops prepared for a charge, the mascot of one of the Kentucky regiments in the Orphan Brigade, a dog named Frank, began chasing after a rabbit. A few of the Kentuckians raised a cheer of encouragement, then more until the entire line was yelling wildly. Believing they were about to be charged, the Federals unleashed a volley into the Kentuckians that flew over their heads, but it caused the rabbit to change directions toward the Kentuckians with Frank in hot pursuit. One soldier yelled, "Run, Cottontail, run! Had I no more a reputation to sustain than you, I would run too. Although the Union line was holding, it would not be doing so for long if help did not arrive. Beatty ordered Gratter's brigade forward to check the Confederate charge, and it worked, but a few Confederates had splashed across the river and threatened the Union flank. Fife's brigade began to waver when their commander was thrown from and dragged by his horse, injuring him badly. The Union left fell back, with Gross's brigade providing a safe place for the front line to fall back behind.
So temporarily
With the Confederates were on
very
the move.
successful.
When Breckinridge's division began to break the Union lines earlier in the battle, the Union High Command went into work like a well-oiled machine behind the Union lines, creating one of the most heroic and determined actions of the war. Rosecrans exhausted his horse, riding around the battlefield, rallying retreating men and ordering up reinforcements to support the Union left. Sweat poured from his face as he coordinated more brigades and artillery pieces. Major General Thomas Crittenden's chief of artillery, Captain John Mendenhall, performed a miraculous action by tirelessly assembling 45 pieces of artillery on the hill overlooking McFadden's Ford to halt the Confederate advance. The Union cannons roared a destructive fire into the approaching Southerner. A member of the 20th Tennessee described it as such. So it was here, if a soldier ever saw the lightning and heard the thunderbolts of a tornado, at the same time the heavens opened and the stars of destruction were sweeping everything from the face of the earth. If he was in this charge, he saw it. A Union soldier wrote, "The very earth trembled as with an exploding mine, and a mass of iron hail was hurled upon them. The artillery bellowed forth such thunder that the men were stunned and could not distinguish sounds. There were falling timbers, crashing arms, and the whirring of missiles in every direction. The bursting of the dreadful shell, the groans of the wounded, the shouts of the officers, mingled in one horrid din that beggars description. It stopped Breckinridge's division in its tracks, and for many of the Southerners, the devastation was too much to withstand again. They broke and ran for cover, the blue troops chasing after and capturing hundreds, and shot the ones who would not surrender in the back. Artillery shells exploded all around the retreating men. One soldier on his way back to safety attempted to commandeer a riderless horse, but as he grabbed the reins, a shell carried away its head. Breckinridge's artillery that had advanced with the infantry was put in a horrible situation as the infantry retreated. Wright's battery on the far right attempted to halt the Federals, so the infantry killed 7,900 missing and captured.
We want to get to the
The
Breckinridge.
success felt by the Confederates on December 31st gave way. Troops were too close, and the guns were captured. Other guns were able to get away, but Captain Wright would be killed. Breckinridge watched in horror
This
as
is
his
the key
division
part.
limped back to safety. He exclaimed, "My poor orphans, my poor orphans." The success felt by the Confederates on December 31st gave way to defeat by nightfall on January 2nd. The next day, Bragg would begin his retreat to Tullahoma, Tennessee. The Union lost 12,906 men, 1,677 killed, 7,543 wounded, 3,686 missing and captured. The Confederacy lost 11,739 troops, 1,294 killed, 7,945 wounded, and 2,500 missing and captured, totaling over 24,000 casualties in one battle.
So that's how they got their name. What's going on? I'm sorry. Okay, here's the here's a Western Theater, Fort Donaldson, Shiloh. We'll talk a little bit about a couple of these I'm way over on time. The first of the situations was for the Orphan Brigade to form up at the beginning of the war when the Confederates were trying to hold southern Kentucky. They had a line from Columbus, where the heights were on the Mississippi, to the Cumberland Gap, and there were quite a few people. So this brigade was stationed at Bowling Green, Kentucky, and they left in February 1862 when they got flanked. Grant was taking out the Donaldson, and it wasn't able to hold on to it. When the brigade left Bowling Green, it had 4,000 men, and according to Jackman's diary, there were only 600 left in that brigade from Kentucky at the end of the war. Second place I went to was Donaldson. So while most of the brigade stayed at Bowling Green and then left at the same time, one regiment, the 2nd Kentucky, went over to Donaldson and ended up being captured in Donaldson. The rest of the regiments all complained that Breckinridge was playing favorites with the commanding officer, and that they were lucky to go, except a month later it was like, no, it wasn't such a good deal, because they got there and they immediately got surrendered. This is Buckner. There were 3 commanders, Floyd, Pillow, and Buckner, in the Confederate Army, and 2 of them left and said, oh, we can't get captured, so they got on a steamboat and left Buckner. Now, what's the significance of that? Buckner was a friend of Ulysses Grant, had in fact given Grant money at one point, and so they thought, well, he might do better, and Ulysses S. Grant said, no, got to surrender. Famous Ulysses S. unconditional surrender Grant. They were exchanged in August. The next major battle is in Shiloh. They fall all the way back to Alabama, and the Union Army follows them. And then Albert Sidney Johnston decides to launch a surprise attack at Shiloh, which is very successful the first day, and they get pushed back on the second day. Here's a picture of that. The battle starts here. They get tied up here in the hornet's nest, and then by the end of the day, it's all the way up at the river where they take it. But they get slowed down there in the hornet's nest, and that's where the 2 parts of the brigade are fighting. Breckinridge is here. On the second day, they engaged 2 divisions from Kentucky. So let's talk about that. Even the enemy admired the work of Old Joe and the 6th Kentucky Regiment. They were trying to fall back. Breckinridge is often given the reserve position. The regiment immediately facing them was the Federal 9th Kentucky. So it was another Kentucky regiment, but this case, Federal one. It had organized in Adair County, just a few miles from Glasgow, where Lewis and his regiment had homes. There were a number of Adair County men among the orphans, and the Kentucky Bluecoats earned a healthy respect for them. They retired slowly and subtly, said the 9th Kentucky colonel of Lewis's withdrawal, fighting well over and disputing every inch of ground, taking advantage of every tree, thicket, log, or other protection. So they eventually had to pull back. The Breckinridge Division was left as a rear guard for 3 days as the Army retreated back to Corning, having won on the first day and failed on the second day. They had 2,400 men when the battle started, and they had 840 wounded or killed. It was one of the most painful days for the regiments. We went into it raw recruits, John Marshall wrote of Shiloh, and came out of it stern and daring veterans. We were literally baptized in fire and blood. Looking back at their baptism on that Sunday, so a Sunday later on, an orphan declared, "Yes, boys, it was the largest meeting that was ever held at Shiloh Church." So he's going to make a metaphor here about the Battle of Shiloh Church. "And wasn't the music grand that day? Talk to me about pianos and organs. I never heard such a big organ as was played last Sunday." An Irishman met Ed Thompson in Corinth a few days later. "We went to church last Sunday week, didn't we?" Thompson said, "Yes, to Shiloh Church." The Irishman said, "Well, I'm not going anymore. I don't like the sermons they preach there at Shiloh." I wish I had fixed this before I came. Next part is Vicksburg and the invasion of Kentucky. I'm going to skip that one. Let's go to Vicksburg, 112. This one's funny, but not funny. It's so Army-like. Hunt's regiment, so they're in the lines at Vicksburg for a little while. They actually go out mostly and get away before the surrender. Hunt's regiment, not to be outdone for ridiculousness, organized a race between two soldiers riding wild hogs. Grabbing them firmly by the ears, the orphan riders held on for dear life as the race began, and their comrades cheered. The enemy heard the cheering, however, and sent a few shells their way to dampen spirits. One burst close enough to the hogs to scatter them with dirt, hurting no one, but putting such a fright into the swine that they bolted at a frantic pace. One threw his rider, but Charlie Edwards, just 3 months with the company, held on to his mount. The hog rushed straight for the 50-foot bluff. Despite efforts of those present to stop it, the animal ran off the edge, with Edwards still astride. The hog survived, but the fall broke Charlie's back, and in a few minutes he died. "This cast a gloom over all," wrote Johnny Green. "A measure of revenge they slaughtered and dined on the late Edwards' noble steed." Those of you that have been with infantry units, you know that it's soldiers will do crazy stuff. They got sent to go up to try to get to the Perryville campaign. Breckinridge was trying to. He was no longer the brigade commander. He wasn't even the division commander. He was a corps commander now. But he was trying to get them to go in, join the Kentucky invasion, so maybe they could go by and see some of their family or get some stuff. And they got all the way up to the Cumberland Gap, and then they got sent back because the Bragg was retreating. But they got back to Murfreesboro, and they had, the brigade was at strength of 2,563, but they had an Alabama regiment. So if you take that out, there was 1,847 of the Kentuckians in the brigade at that time. But sick or absent, not with the brigade, those were ready for duty, was another 2,418. So that's how much, the losses were for them in these campaigns. Chickamauga. This is the Battle of Chickamauga. The orphans are on the flank. Longstreet launches again, this is a battle you can go visit. Jack Thacker from Western, history teacher, used to take the cadets from WKU down there every couple years to go look at this, and he'd make us walk the battlefield. So the orphans were right in this area. The breakthrough came here, and where General Thomas Rocket of Chickamauga was able to hold the line. They tried to make a breakthrough. This shows how many men they lost in the battle, though. 2nd Kentucky lost 142, 9th Kentucky 102. One of the commanders who got killed, the brigade commander at this point was Helm. read just 2 more things and then we'll try to take some questions. Far from Chickamauga, in the capital of the United States, another Kentuckian grieved the news of Helm's death. His brother-in-law, Abraham Lincoln, sorrowed deeply. I feel as David of old did, he lamented, when told of the death of Absalom. So Helm was his brother-in-law. Helm's wife was the half-sister of Mary Todd Lincoln, and they were friends. Lincoln tried to give him a job as the paymaster of the Union Army, but he wanted to be in the Confederate Army, and he was. And he got killed in that battle. The Lord has given us a great victory in the fight, and we cannot be thankful to him for it. They gave their dead. They buried them in 2s and 3s in shallow graves marked only by crude wooden headboards, with names or initials scratched in pencil. All the passerbyers would see in years to come it was remembrance of the valor and pain of those orphan dead, were a few low mounds of earth, and above them the hasty inscriptions. Some poor boys could not even be identified. Atop one mound sat an oak board with the simple words, 3 or 4 Kentuckians, spelled with a Y, CSA, are buried here, like here. So their spelling wasn't great. That night, in the exultation of victory, the Orphan Brigade camped along the Chickahominy. Indians said the stream's name meant River of Death. Certainly it did for those Kentuckians far from home. Okay, there was a little bit more, but again, I had to consolidate it from what I gave before. And I'm sorry I ran over on trying to do too much stuff. Any questions?
It's a lot to digest.
Yeah, I know, it was a lot to digest. Yeah. There's a lot to find. Any questions, comments? There were quite a few more quotes I wanted to get to. I got too long on the elections, I'm sorry. Yes, please.
Any idea how many, I think somebody here probably knows, how many Logan Countyans were in the Orphan Brigade?
I don't know. I tried to find what the numbers were for each of the different counties, and it is written down somewhere, and I can give it to you, but I don't remember what it was.
Logan County history said there were 1,000 in the Confederate cause and 500 in the Union cause of Logan County. I only know one, which was my great-grandfather's twin brother.
Twin brother, oh.
John Henry Pearson, who was in the Orphan Brigade.
Some of the regiments, so the 1st Kentucky went to Virginia right off the bat, so they weren't even in this theater, but they were from Kentucky. And then there were a lot of cavalry units, you know, obviously John Morgan Hunt's cavalry units were there. The 1st Cavalry Brigade, which was one of the units with Forrest, Nathan Bedford Forrest, was from Kentucky. And the majority of the recruitment was along the north and the east side were more Union. Remember, West Virginia sort of were all Union. They became a separate state because they didn't want to be with Virginia. So, and then the southern part of the state and then along the Mississippi was much more Confederate. And, you know, much more slave holding things, right? About between 100 and 50,000 men joined the Union Army over the course of the war, and about 40,000 joined the Confederate. But that's probably because it was occupied for the whole war. So it was a lot harder for the men in Kentucky to join the Confederate Army, that's for sure, yeah.
Have you ever heard how many the reunions they had? You know, we saw the one in Russellville, picture of them.
I'm sure they had quite a few. First time I ever saw a reunion was right after I went to Gettysburg, and there was an old booklet that the National Park Service had put together about the last reunion in Gettysburg. And they had them camping out on the field, and they were feeding them on these wooden tables that they had laid out there, regular Army mess sort of things and all. And they were very happy because they were only losing 7,000 veterans a day because they were in their 90s or something. And it was just insane. And they had all come up to Gettysburg, and they were sitting together, right? in the different places. They were visiting the places that they had fought. And they're living in the tents like they were soldiers and eating Army mess food and hanging out together. And it was quite amazing. And it was a very interesting, I had no idea that had been going on, these reunions. I'm going to a reunion in September for my class. I love Army reunions. They're a lot of fun. More questions? Anything you didn't know from before?
I was amazed how small they got before they disbanded.
They were cavalry regiment size by the time it was over. They would take and remember, a lot of people get sick in the Civil War, so there'd be 200 guys sick on a given day who would come back, or they would get wounded and they would come back. And obviously the ones that were dead or deserted would not come back. And plenty of them deserted. Plenty of them got captured. So this kid got captured in Jonesboro. At the end of the Jonesboro was the last battle in the campaign at Atlanta. He's from Franklin here, and he ended up escaping twice and got all the way home. And when he got to his house, he knew he had to be careful because if somebody saw him, he'd get picked up by the local forces. And so he talked to one of the people out by the barn, and his father came out and he talked to him. And his father said, well, there's like 10 Union officers in the house right now, so you can't come in. So he sent him down to his aunt's house or something. And eventually he was able to stay for a few days, but then he just thought it was too dangerous for his parents. And he took off and immediately was walking down this creek bed. And as he got to the bottom, the Union soldiers on the one side, and then more came up behind him, and he got captured again, and he got sent up to Louisville and was in a prison where he was poorly treated in a prison. But he spent a lot of the war after Atlanta campaign in a prisoner of war camp. He was so angry at the commander that he tried to shoot him in a Louisville hotel 2 years later. Any other questions?
So how long did the Orphan Brigade last?
So they went all the way to the last day. There were still 600 or 700 of them in the cavalry mounted infantry units in Georgia and South Carolina, trying to keep Sherman from going all the way up to North Carolina. And they surrendered there. A few days after Lee had surrendered. In fact, they found out from their commander they were about to make an attack, to try a spoiling attack, and they got told by their cavalry division, that the war was over. So the commander, the colonel, sent a note over to the other guy, to the commander, and said, meet us at this town in Georgia, and I'll surrender and turn over because I've been told to surrender. And unfortunately, they got to that town a few days later, and then Jefferson Davis was fleeing south, and he came through with the cabinet. And then the day later, Breckinridge shows up. He's the Secretary of War for the Confederacy, and he's trying to get out of there. And he comes through town the day before. And so they're thinking, we just totally surrendered. We just gave up Breckinridge by mistake by picking that day and that town where Breckinridge shows up, even though they had no idea that was going to happen. But that was the end of the war for them. And then they all got sent home and got to come to the reunions, which is amazing. Okay, thanks so much for coming, and I'm sorry it was a little bit too much.
That was good. Thank you.